Thank you. I'm going to start off just by saying that I'm quite a simple person. I like to see things in simple packages. And to me, admin data comes in two basic sorts. There's those admin data that are collected purely for statistical purposes. So things like crime statistics, things like hospital waiting times, where there is a need to measure against targets, or there is a need to publish some very important data, and the producers have set up an administrative process to do that. There's a second source of admin data as well, and that is admin data that has primarily been created for operational purposes to deliver an operational process. And the use of the data and the publication of statistics on the back of those data is almost a byproduct of that process. And I want to focus on the second one of those, the operational data, because that's the area that I've been really heavily involved in. A lot of people think that statistics using administrative data is quite a new thing. And it isn't. The DWP have been producing statistics of admin data for about 2 decades. I became a professional statistician in 2001, and ever since day one, I've been playing around with admin data. But that doesn't mean to say that we can rest on our laurels, because things are changing. The data's changing, techniques are changing, technology's changing. The huge vastness of data that's becoming available to people is changing as well. And also, data and admin data suddenly become sexy. And because it's sexy, lots of other people want to play with it. And therefore, we've got a lot of competitors sort of competing, for want of a better word, for the market that we're in. As David says, you know, we've in the department's been doing this for an awful long time. We produce a lot of official and national statistics for admin data. And I've really cut my teeth on it. And I'm really passionate about admin data. I absolutely love it. And I sort of see playing with admin data a bit like playing with a tiger cub. It's great fun to play with, really fluffy, and you can really get down and roll around in it and get really stuck in. And everybody that's not playing with it looks at you with envy and wishes they wanted to play with it as well. But you've got to know what you're doing, because if you're not wary and you're not cautious, that tiger cub could scratch and bite you. And if it does scratch and bite you, it's really going to hurt. And the same thing applies for administrative data. If you don't know what you're doing with it, you can make some catastrophic mistakes. Now, one of my big soapboxes is management information. I work in an operational department. My operational colleagues think management information is, you know, the bee's knees. It's absolutely sort of 100% top quality, lots of decisions made on it. Management information is always incorrect. It is always wrong. I have never seen any management information that is correct. Doesn't mean to say it's useless or it's rubbish. But what we have to do is we have to just step back. We have to step back and think, what is management information there for? What is the purpose of management information? And is it suitable for the purpose it is intended for? Now, management information is intended to make operational decisions. So if I know I need to produce 10,000 widgets and my MI is telling me that I'm producing 12,000 widgets, that's fine, because I won't be making different decisions on the back of that. But if my MI is telling me that I'm producing 100,000 widgets, well, I'm going to make a very, very different operational decision than I would do otherwise. And therefore, it's the quantum that's important rather than the detail. But the problem with management information is that they're generally specified when systems are created. They're generally aggregated. And whoever's specified and the people involved in writing the specifications have usually moved onto a different job, into a different department, and no one really knows what the MI is counting. And this has come to bite us in our department quite often. Definitions are forgotten. What are we counting? If we're bringing management information around average waiting times for a benefit, what average are we using? When are we starting the clock? When does the clock finish? Are we talking means? Are we talking medians? Does anyone care? Well, I do, because I'm a statistician, and I do as well, because if I start having to report that into the public domain, it's very, very important that I don't mislead members of the public. It's very, very important that I don't mislead Parliament, and it's also very, very important I don't mislead my policymakers, because if I do, they could make quite catastrophic decisions based on incorrect data. And this is where statisticians and analysts generally really add value in this whole sphere. I worry about open data and transparency. I know instinctively open data and transparency is a good thing. But if we're not careful, open data and transparency in the wrong hands would be like giving that tiger cub to someone that's only ever played with a kitten. They could do terribly, terribly bad things with it. And those bad things, especially if reported in the media, could actually totally direct the way that society thinks. And I think it's my duty as a statistician to make sure these things don't happen. Now, the first thing we always hear about when we talk about big data and administrative data sets, the big misconception is an administrative data is complete, it's 100%. So take, for example, for sake of argument, I have an administrative database of all the people on a particular benefit. Straight away we think, right, that database has everybody on that benefit. Well, no, that's not correct, because n does not equal all. N equals all plus an error rate. And it has an error rate because there will be duplicate records. There will be records, for example, that haven't been properly closed down and cleansed off the system. There will be records that have been erroneously put on the system. There will be records that may have been put on the system for a very good reason, but we don't really know what that reason is, and the reason might not be the reason we want to count those data. So yes, n equals all plus an error rate. Okay, well, we could actually strip out the error rate if we know what we're talking about. But also, there is a delta there as well. N is actually less than all, because there will be some records that actually aren't included in that database that we might think are included. So take my benefit database again. Let's say I think my database is a record of everybody who's on job seekers allowance. Well, it isn't, because we have some cases that are managed clerically. We have some special cases for security reasons which aren't put on the various databases. And unless you understand that as well, you don't understand what the full level of your data are. So n equals all plus epsilon minus delta. The other problem we have is, we've all heard this phrase, garbage in, garbage out. But how do we as statisticians, looking at a sanitised data set, know what the garbage is? Something that looks like garbage might not actually be garbage. It might be something that's there for a very, very good reason. It just happens not to be the reason that we want for our statistic. And an example of this is when I set up the Work and Pensions longitudinal study. That basically is a data transfer between Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs and ourselves. And it's an individual level database which looks at spells between employment and benefits. And on the employment data, about 20% of the records had a 6th of April start date. 20% of all employment started on the first day of the financial year. Looks a little bit odd to me. So how am I going to understand why that happens? Well, the way we did it is we actually went out and sat down with the people who were putting the data into the database. We went out and we understood what the motivations were behind those clerical officers. Why would you create a record on the first day of the financial year? And what we learned from that, first of all, is we learned the purpose for the database. Why did HMRC create this specific database? And it had one primary purpose, and that was to ensure that the Revenue and Customs knew how many spells in employment every individual had in a tax year, so that we could actually make sure that their end-of-year tax returns covered all those employment spells. So if I'm that clerical officer at Revenue and Customs, receives notification from an employer that someone has left their employment, I need to close the case off. Can't find the case. What do? I create a dummy case so that I can close it off. That dummy case, I know it's in employment in that year, I'll put the first day of the financial year in there. That's fine, that's very reasonable, that's very sensible, it does the job for the operational system. Does it do the job for me as a statistician? Well, yes and no. Because sometimes I just want to know how many people have been in employment in that particular year. Sometimes, however, I want to know the flows between benefit and employment, and for that purpose, a start date is really, really important. So what I'm saying is, when we have these administrative data sets, we need to really, really document the reasons that people do things. It's not all things to all people. Data has to be used really intelligently. You need to understand why people are putting the data in the way they're doing it and what purpose you want to use that data for. You can marry the two together, and then you as an analyst, you as a statistician, you as a user of that data set, make your own intelligent choices on which records you choose to use and which records you choose not to use. The other element of understanding behavioural motivations of clerical staff that are putting the data in here, really you need to sit down. If you spend some time working in operations, it's a bit of a no-brainer really. But in operations, you're under a lot of pressure to turn around a lot of quantity and a lot of quality information. And so you will take shortcuts wherever possible if that shortcut is not relevant to either the specific job you're doing or to the specific area you're working in. And one of the really quick shortcuts that data entry staff do is to pick the top record of a drop-down box. If that drop-down box isn't relevant to you actually turning the case around, or you don't think it's relevant to actually making a decision on the case, just pick the top one and move on. Now, again, if you don't understand that could be quite difficult for us. One of my statistics records the nationality of foreign individuals who come to this country and claim a national insurance number. The time before last I published that information was just before the European elections. And it was just after the lifting of the restrictions on the aid to accession countries, the Bulgarians and Romanians into the country. Quite high-profile political statistics. I needed to make sure they were right. Now, if in open data transparency world I'd have just chucked out the MI, knowing how the MI is collected on these sorts of things, I can bet you my mortgage you would have seen an influx of Albanians and Bulgarians coming into the country, because they're the two records that are at the top of the drop-down box. Fortunately, we understood this sort of stuff, and we put our analytic common sense on top of this, and that's not what we recorded. Because if we had have recorded that, and one of the red tops had got hold of it, that could have changed the outcome of that election. You know, this is how serious it is, and this is how dangerous these data are unless they're used cleverly and intelligently. So the way I do this is I don't know if any of you have seen that film Meet the Fockers, and Robert De Niro has his little circle of trust. Well, I've got something similar. I've got a little circle of trust of administrative data sources within the department. Some of those data are right squarely in the centre of those. Payment systems, I'm actually giving money out. Well, not me personally. My department's giving money out to individuals. We need to make sure it's right. Those data sets are crawled all over by auditors and all sorts of things. That's right in the centre of my circle of trust. There are other systems which have... That's a strange noise, I hope that was me. There are other systems which have radial boxes or ticks boxes on the operational screen. Our labour markets, our labour market databases, for example, does that. And some of those tick boxes are pretty trustworthy because I know they're important in the operational process that input is doing. Some of them have been put there purely to count things for statistical purposes. And I know from my years talking to operation data inputters that they treat those with a lot less robustness than they would otherwise. So those sorts of tick boxes are right outside my circle of trust. And then there are some databases which sort of straddle my circle of trust. There are elements within it which I trust. There are elements outside it which I don't trust. So how do we understand, how do we bring together our knowledge of all this to actually produce something that meets the very high and quite rightly high levels of scrutiny that are needed to produce official and national statistics? The main way I do it in my department is I triangulate. I always triangulate between different data sources. If I've got some information that I can link to my payment system and my payment system is telling me something slightly different to one of my other data sources, I will actually trust the payment system information over and above the other data source. Now, triangulating data is a lot easier said than done. You might think, DWP, massive department, massive amounts of data. We are fortunate that we have national insurance number. National insurance number by law can only be used for tax and benefit purposes, so it isn't a national identifier. That's quite good. But I also bring in other data that doesn't have national insurance number, and we need to do various fuzzy matching techniques around that. But in order to triangulate that data, irrespective of how good the personal identifier is, You need the data on a granular individual level. And if you go back to the beginning of my talk, you remember that I said that most of these systems have been set up for operational purposes, not statistical purposes. And it is really, really difficult, once a system's been set up, to actually get hold of granular individual level data. It's expensive, it takes time. Most operational systems are off-the-shelf packages which have been tweaked for a particular purpose. As I've said before, the guys that have done the tweaking have disappeared. No one really knows what's under the bonnet of them. And because it's a lot of work, our external IT contractors will charge us exorbitant amounts of money to actually do the work to be able to bring the data back in. I get a bit frustrated at that because I see them as departmental assets, but because we haven't specced out the statistical need at the front of the programme, I then am spending exorbitant amounts of money getting hold of data which is DWP data, which is why it's really important that we get in right at the beginning of producing operational systems if we think we want to be talking about anything that system is delivering. Just to give you a bit of an insight to how complicated some of these data systems is, my next slide that I'm about to put up is a very small schematic of the personal independence payment customer system. You don't need to read any of the words on that. That is a really small portion of... That's basically under the bonnet of the operational system. I don't understand that. I don't understand that at all. Fortunately, I've recruited some people into my department that do understand that. They're my statistical data scientists. And what we do is we take all the data in that format, bring it into the department, and we take a snapshot of it. It's called a historic data store. We photograph it. Then we transform the data, and we transform the data into a way that people with my limited technological knowledge can actually understand. Individual level claims, facts, dimensions. There's the whole technique about dimensional data modelling and stuff like that. But it means that most people with a modicum of intelligence and skills could actually understand what the data's telling you. Whereas, crikey, to understand anything in that, you needed basically to build the system, or you might as well just go home straight away. So by being able to do that, it means that all the data, or an awful lot of the data systems in the department are actually sitting within my grasp and my control. I have access to the granular individual level data. And then suddenly the world's my oyster. I can chop and dice and slice it however I want. I can mix it and match it with other data sources. I can do my triangulations. I can then sit back and really, really understand what the data's telling me. And because we're linking into operational systems, we can make some of this very, very timely. My universal credit statistics, one element of those universal credit statistics are 3 working days after the event. I publish the statistics 3 days after the event happens. Other elements in that statistic are 4 weeks because we're looking for retrospection, but part of it is just 3 working days after the event. So don't have anybody tell you that, we don't like statistics because they're not timely, they're always like 6 months, a year out of date. If you're working with these systems, timeliness isn't the problem. But timeliness is a little bit different to preparation. It can take you 6 months, a year to actually produce and develop the process. Once the process is produced and developed, you can churn things out really quickly. So for these UC stats, I'm putting them out every month. So, summarising this, the benefits of using administrative data are huge, absolutely huge. But if we get it wrong, ultimately, we can change an election. That's how dangerous it is. That's how toxic it is. So if there's 3 things to take away from my talk is N equals all plus epsilon minus delta. MI is always wrong, period. And you really need to understand why people put data into data systems. And finally, with admin data, treat it with respect. Because that tiger cub is going to get bigger. And unless you've prepared for it, the 8-foot beast might not fit into your sitting room. And that's where we are with the department at the moment. Our sitting room, our data warehouse, isn't quite big enough for the tiger that we've grown. Thank you.